This can't be true. This can't be true, can it?
At 9:23 a.m., a man walks calmly into his workplace, nods at coworkers, and settles into his day like nothing is wrong. But less than an hour earlier, his wife lay dying on the concrete floor of their garage, and he knew it, because he was the one who put her there. Welcome back to Fearful Crime Channel, where we uncover the stories that hide behind polite smiles, quiet neighborhoods, and the people you'd never suspect. If you're new here, subscribe and turn on notifications, because this story doesn't just unfold, it unravels. This is the story of Kristil Krug, and the man who convinced the world someone else killed her. A marriage that looked perfect. From the outside, Kristil Krug's life looked peaceful. She lived in a quiet Colorado neighborhood with her husband Daniel and their 3 children. Both educated, both respected. A family that appeared stable, successful, and safe. But behind closed doors, something was breaking. Over the months leading up to her death, Kristil had begun to feel watched. It started subtly. Messages from an unfamiliar number. Then strange comments. Details about her daily routine that no stranger should have known.
My wife isn't responding to text messages or phone calls.
Someone was tracking her movements. And the scariest part? They seemed to know everything. The stalker appears. The messages soon identified a name. Anthony, an ex-boyfriend from decades earlier. Someone Kristil hadn't spoken to in years. At first she brushed it off. Then the messages turned graphic, then threatening. He claimed to see her everywhere. He commented on where she parked. He mentioned her children. Kristil did what anyone would do. She went to police. Officers checked her car for trackers. Nothing. They inspected her home. Nothing. Still, the fear didn't go away, because whoever this was knew too much. The first lie. Soon after, something even stranger happened. Daniel called police to report a break-in. According to him, someone had entered their garage and stolen a spare key. Nothing else was missing. At the time, it sounded like part of the same terrifying pattern. But this was no coincidence. This was the opening move, because while police were searching for an outside threat, someone much closer was quietly setting the stage. A perfect setup. As weeks passed, the harassment intensified. The stalker sent photos of Daniel at work, sent threats, claimed he was watching the family in real time. Kristil was terrified. She installed cameras, logged every message, started carrying protection. She even hired a private investigator. And all the while, the person responsible lived under the same roof. The morning everything ended. On an ordinary morning, Kristil dropped her children off at school and returned home. Minutes later, someone entered the garage. Someone she trusted. There were no signs of forced entry. No struggle caught on camera. Only silence. When she didn't respond to texts, Daniel called police, calm, composed, concerned. But when officers arrived, they found Kristil lying lifeless on the garage floor. The crime scene told a horrifying story. And yet, the man standing just outside, shaking, crying, playing the grieving husband, was the very person who had orchestrated every step. The lie that fooled everyone. To police, it looked like a stalker finally struck. To family, it was an unimaginable tragedy. To Daniel, it was supposed to be the perfect crime. He believed he had covered every angle, every message, every digital footprint. He believed the blame would fall on a ghost. But what he didn't realize was that the lie he created was too perfect, and that would be his undoing. The police didn't arrest Daniel that day. In fact, they didn't even suspect him, not yet. At first glance, everything about the scene supported his story. There were no signs of forced entry, no struggle that suggested rage or panic. Kristil's body lay exactly where Daniel said he'd found her. The garage door showed no damage, no fingerprints out of place, no neighbors reported screams, no witnesses, just silence. And silence in investigations like this can be dangerously misleading. Detectives treated the case as a homicide carried out by an unknown stalker. The same mysterious figure who had been sending Kristil disturbing messages for months. It made sense. Too much sense. And that's exactly why it worked. Daniel leaned into the role perfectly. He cried when officers spoke to him. His voice cracked when he talked about his children. He repeated the same phrase over and over. I should have protected her. It was convincing, almost rehearsed, though no one noticed that yet. What investigators didn't realize was that the story had already been written long before Kristil took her final breath. The first real crack in the illusion appeared during a routine digital review. Detectives began collecting Kristil's phone, laptop, and cloud data, hoping to trace the so-called stalker. The messages were disturbing, obsessive, threatening, deeply personal. But something about them felt off. The writing style was inconsistent, sometimes aggressive, sometimes strangely calculated. And then there were the timestamps. Some of the messages had been sent at moments that didn't line up with the stalker's supposed location. Others were sent during times when the suspect should have been asleep, at work, or otherwise accounted for. It didn't prove anything yet, but it planted doubt. Meanwhile, Daniel was doing interviews, talking to friends, repeating his pain to anyone who would listen. And every time he spoke, his version of events shifted ever so slightly. Not enough to raise alarms, but enough to make investigators take notes. Then came the digital footprint. A forensic analyst discovered that several of the messages sent to Kristil were routed through apps installed on Daniel's own devices. Apps that allowed number masking, apps that created false identities, apps that left behind small but unmistakable traces if you knew where to look. At first, detectives assumed Kristil might have installed them herself, perhaps out of fear, maybe to track the stalker. But when they cross-checked timestamps, something chilling emerged. Some of the messages were sent while Kristil was actively on the phone with someone else, someone who claimed to be with coworkers at the time, Daniel. The more they dug, the more the mask began to slip. Search history revealed obsessive behavior. Forums, surveillance tools, burner phone guides. Financial records showed purchases that lined up perfectly with equipment used to stalk and monitor someone undetected. Still, the case wasn't solid enough. And then came the final detail that shattered everything. During a reconstruction of the morning Kristil died, investigators noticed something impossible. According to Daniel, he had already left for work when the attack occurred. But data from his vehicle, data he didn't know was stored, showed the car never left the driveway. Not until much later. Which meant he was there. The man who claimed to be miles away was standing in that garage. Suddenly, the entire narrative flipped. The stalker wasn't some faceless monster hiding in the shadows. The stalker had been sleeping beside her. The truth was no longer hiding. It was staring them in the face. And now the only question left was simple. How do you prove that a man who planned everything so carefully finally made a mistake big enough to destroy himself? Because in the next chapter, everything starts to fall apart. By the time investigators realized the truth, the case was no longer about if Daniel Krug was responsible. It was about how much he had planned and how far he was willing to go to protect the lie he had built. The shift was subtle at first. No dramatic accusation, no handcuffs, just a quiet change in tone. Conversations with Daniel became more precise, questions repeated, timelines revisited, each answer carefully compared to the last. And slowly, the cracks widened. Detectives began reconstructing the days leading up to Kristil's death minute by minute. They examined phone records, location data, and security logs. Individually, each piece looked harmless. Together, they formed a pattern that was impossible to ignore. Daniel had portrayed himself as a man blindsided by tragedy, but the evidence painted a man preparing for it. Investigators discovered that the harassment Kristil experienced didn't escalate randomly. It escalated strategically. The messages increased whenever she began to feel safe. Whenever she stopped talking about fear, the threats returned stronger. Someone was controlling the emotional temperature of her life, and that someone knew her schedule better than anyone else ever could. Then came the surveillance. Hidden cameras placed around the home had captured movement patterns, not of a stalker lurking in the shadows, but of someone who already had access, someone who knew exactly where the blind spots were, someone who never appeared on camera because he didn't need to. When analysts overlaid timestamps from the footage with Daniel's phone data, something disturbing emerged. The periods when the so-called stalker was active aligned almost perfectly with moments Daniel was alone. The illusion was collapsing, but Daniel still played his part flawlessly. He showed up to interviews with a calm face and steady voice. He spoke about Kristil with practiced sorrow. He cried on cue. He thanked officers for everything they were doing. What he didn't realize was that the emotional performance was becoming part of the evidence. Investigators noticed he never asked the questions grieving spouses usually ask. He didn't want updates. He didn't ask about progress. He didn't ask if they were close. It was as if he already knew the answers. The turning point came when analysts uncovered the digital trail behind the anonymous messages. The accounts used to threaten Kristil had been created from devices tied to the home. Not directly, but close enough to raise alarms. Data fragments, cached activity, residual fingerprints in the system that couldn't be erased completely. Daniel had planned carefully. But no plan is perfect. When confronted with inconsistencies, his story began to fracture. Timelines shifted. Minor details changed. He contradicted himself. Not in dramatic ways, but in subtle ones that only seasoned investigators catch. And then came the mistake that sealed everything. During a follow-up interview, Daniel casually mentioned something about the day of Kristil's death, a detail that had never been made public, a detail only the killer could know. The room went quiet. From that moment on, the investigation stopped being about finding a suspect and became about proving what they already knew. Surveillance intensified. Phone activity was monitored, conversations were recorded, and slowly, Daniel began to realize the walls were closing in. But even then, he didn't run, because in his mind, he was still smarter than everyone else. He believed he had outthought the system. What he didn't realize was that the system was now letting him believe that, just long enough to gather what they needed. And when the final evidence came together, it wasn't dramatic. It was devastating. In one quiet moment, the carefully constructed illusion collapsed under its own weight. The man who had convinced an entire community that a phantom stalker had destroyed his family was finally exposed as the one who had orchestrated everything from the beginning. By the time law enforcement was ready to move, Daniel still believed he was in control. He woke up that morning like he had every other day since Kristil's death, calm, composed, and convinced that the storm had passed. The interviews had slowed. The phone calls had quieted. To him, that silence meant success. He believed the worst was over. What he didn't know was that the silence was intentional. Behind the scenes, investigators had completed the final pieces of their case. Every message, every movement, every contradiction had been carefully mapped. They weren't rushing anymore. They were waiting, because when they made their move, it needed to be final. And then, without warning, it happened. Detectives arrived not with chaos or sirens, but with calm authority. Their tone was controlled, their expressions unreadable. They asked Daniel to come with them, just to clarify a few things. He agreed without hesitation. Inside the interrogation room, the air felt heavier. The questions started gently, familiar ground he had walked through many times before. He answered smoothly, confidently, even offering details that hadn't been asked for. He believed this was just another performance. But then the shift came. The lead investigator leaned forward and mentioned something small, something precise. A detail from the morning of Kristil's death that had never been released publicly. Daniel froze. It was brief, just a fraction of a second, but it was enough. His eyes darted, his posture stiffened, his breathing changed. The room went quiet. That was the moment he realized the game was over. The evidence followed quickly after that. Phone records, digital trails, surveillance data, timelines that contradicted his every claim, each piece stacked neatly on the table, not rushed, not emotional, just undeniable. Daniel tried to explain it away. He stumbled over words, backtracked, offered new versions of old stories, but the calm confidence he once had was gone. In its place was desperation. And desperation makes people careless. When confronted with the evidence tying him to the digital stalking, he stopped speaking altogether. His lawyer intervened. The interview ended. Hours later, he was arrested. The news spread fast. Neighbors were stunned. Co-workers couldn't believe it. Friends replayed every memory, searching for signs they'd missed. The man they thought they knew, the quiet husband, the grieving widower, was now accused of orchestrating a long, calculated campaign of psychological terror against his own wife. But the most chilling realization came afterward. This hadn't been a crime of rage. It was a crime of patience. Every message, every fake threat, Every staged moment had been designed to shape a narrative. He wanted investigators looking outward while he stayed hidden in plain sight. He wanted sympathy. He wanted control. And for a while, it worked. In court, the evidence told the story he never could. The digital trail, the contradictions. The lies layered on top of lies. One by one, the illusion collapsed. The man who believed himself smarter than everyone in the room sat silently as the truth dismantled him. There was no dramatic outburst, no confession filled with emotion. Just the quiet weight of consequences finally catching up. When the verdict came, it echoed through the courtroom, not with shock but with a strange sense of inevitability. Justice had taken its time, but it had arrived. And as Kristil's family listened, they finally had something they'd been denied for so long: clarity. Yet even with the case closed, one question lingered in the minds of everyone who followed it. How does someone live two lives so convincingly? And how many warning signs did everyone miss? That question is what lingers long after the trial ends. When the courtroom doors finally closed, there was no celebration. No relief that felt complete. Only a heavy stillness. The kind that settles in after something irreversible has happened. Daniel was gone from public view, but the damage he left behind lingered in every corner of the lives he touched. For Kristil's family, justice didn't feel like victory. It felt like survival. They had lost a daughter, a sister, a mother, and no verdict could ever return what was taken. The community struggled too. Neighbors replayed memories over and over, asking themselves how they missed the signs, how someone so ordinary, so unremarkable, could carry out something so calculated. People who had once waved hello now questioned every interaction they'd ever had with him. Because the most unsettling truth wasn't that he was capable of murder. It was that he blended in perfectly. He attended meetings. He went to work. He smiled at strangers. He played the role of a grieving husband so convincingly that even trained investigators initially believed him. And that's the part that stays with you. Evil doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it hides behind routine. Sometimes it looks just like everyone else. In the aftermath, experts examined the case not just to understand what happened, but how it happened. They spoke about control, obsession, and the dangerous power of manipulation. About how technology, when placed in the wrong hands, can become a weapon. And about how warning signs are often only obvious in hindsight. Kristil's story became a lesson, not just a tragedy. A reminder to trust intuition, to take fear seriously, to understand that emotional manipulation can be just as deadly as physical violence. For those who loved her, her memory became something stronger than the crime itself. They spoke her name. They shared her story. They refused to let her be remembered only as a victim. And for the man who orchestrated it all? He was left with silence. No audience. No sympathy. No control. Just the weight of what he had done. This case didn't end with chaos or spectacle. It ended with truth, and slow, painful, undeniable truth. And maybe that's what makes it even more haunting, because it reminds us that the most terrifying monsters don't hide in the dark. They live among us. If this story kept you watching until the end, take a moment to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who needs to hear it. This is Fearful Crime, where we uncover the stories that refuse to stay buried.